Stop whatever you are doing, because what you are about to hear is not diplomatic posturing that will be walked back in subsequent negotiations, not a rhetorical escalation designed to extract concessions in ongoing talks, and not the kind of nuclear brinkmanship that has characterized Iranian responses to Western pressure for the past 2 decades. Tonight, the Supreme Leader of Iran has authorized a fundamental expansion of the Islamic Republic's nuclear program that includes increasing uranium enrichment to 90% weapons-grade purity at multiple facilities, installing thousands of advanced IR-6 centrifuges that will accelerate fissile material production by factors of 10 compared to existing infrastructure, and withdrawing all cooperation with International Atomic Energy Agency inspection protocols that have provided the international community with visibility into Iranian nuclear activities since the collapse of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The announcement came exactly 72 hours after President Donald Trump issued a public ultimatum demanding that Iran completely dismantle its nuclear enrichment capabilities within 30 days or face what he described as military consequences that would make the maximum pressure campaign of his first administration look like gentle persuasion. The ultimatum was delivered without consultation with European allies, without coordination with Gulf partners, and without apparent consideration of how Iran might respond to threats that offer no diplomatic pathway and that demand complete capitulation on the core issue that Iran has spent 2 decades and tens of billions of dollars developing indigenous capability to address. The Iranian response is not capitulation. The Iranian response is the exact opposite of what Trump's ultimatum was designed to achieve, representing acceleration rather than abandonment of nuclear development and constituting the most significant expansion of Iranian nuclear capability since the program began in the 1980s. The number that has Western intelligence agencies conducting emergency assessments is 12 months. 12 months is the current estimate of how long Iran will require to produce sufficient weapons-grade uranium for its first nuclear device if the announced expansion proceeds as planned, down from the previous estimate of 18 to 24 months under the existing program constraints. The ultimatum that was supposed to force Iranian surrender has instead triggered exactly the nuclear breakout scenario that American policy has been designed to prevent for 20 years. This is not merely the story of a diplomatic miscalculation. This is the story of how ultimatums that offer no face-saving exits and no negotiated pathways force adversaries toward the exact outcomes that ultimatums are designed to prevent. This is the story of how Iran has spent 2 decades developing nuclear infrastructure specifically designed to be resilient against military attack and diplomatic pressure, and how that infrastructure can be rapidly expanded when leadership concludes that cooperation and restraint have failed to achieve sanctions relief or security guarantees. And this is the story of how the fundamental assumption governing American Iran policy, that sufficient pressure will force capitulation, has collided with an Iranian strategic culture that views resistance to pressure as existential, and that responds to ultimatums by demonstrating that pressure creates resolve rather than surrender. If this channel has been showing you how American coercive diplomacy systematically fails against adversaries who refuse to accept the assumptions on which that coercion is based, now is the moment to make sure you never miss an analysis. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with everyone in your network who understands that threats only work when adversaries believe compliance is less costly than defiance, and that ultimatums without diplomatic off-ramps create exactly the crises they claim to prevent. Tonight's analysis takes you inside every dimension of this crisis. The actual technical specifications of Iran's announced nuclear expansion and how the program will achieve weapons-grade enrichment capability far faster than previous timelines suggested was possible. The strategic logic driving Iranian leadership to respond to Trump's ultimatum with escalation rather than compliance, and why the calculus that worked to pressure smaller nations fails against regional powers with ideological commitments to resistance. the military implications of Iran achieving nuclear weapons capability, and how that capability fundamentally alters the regional balance of power in ways that cannot be reversed through conventional military options. The diplomatic fractures this crisis is creating between the United States and European allies who view the Trump ultimatum as reckless escalation that has destroyed years of patient diplomacy, and the civilizational question that now confronts American strategy. What happens when the central pillar of Middle East policy, preventing Iranian nuclear weapons, fails not because Iran successfully concealed its program, but because American pressure tactics accelerated Iranian decisions to cross the threshold that diplomacy and sanctions were supposed to prevent them from crossing? The Iranian nuclear program that exists today is fundamentally different from the program that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action constrained between 2015 and 2018, and dramatically more advanced than the program that existed when Trump withdrew from the JCPOA and reimposed maximum pressure sanctions. The infrastructure that Iran has built during the 6 years since JCPOA collapse includes thousands of advanced centrifuges that were prohibited under the agreement, stockpiles of 20% and 60% enriched uranium that provide feedstock for rapid breakout to weapons-grade material, and deeply buried enrichment facilities at Fordow and Natanz that are hardened against aerial bombardment and that can continue operations even under sustained military attack. The technical announcement that Iran has made involves 3 components that collectively represent the most significant expansion of nuclear capability since the program's inception. The first component is the decision to begin enriching uranium to 90% U-235 purity, which is defined as weapons-grade material suitable for use in nuclear weapons. Iran has previously enriched to 60%, which is far beyond what is needed for civilian nuclear power applications, but which still requires additional enrichment steps to reach weapons-grade purity. The decision to proceed to 90% enrichment eliminates this remaining technical barrier and demonstrates both capability and intent to produce weapons-usable material. The second component is the installation of thousands of additional IR-6 centrifuges at the Fordow and Natanz enrichment facilities. The IR-6 is an advanced centrifuge that enriches uranium approximately 10 times faster than the IR-1 centrifuges that formed the basis of Iran's early enrichment program. Each IR-6 cascade can produce significantly more enriched material per unit time than older centrifuge models, meaning the expansion of IR-6 deployment will dramatically accelerate Iran's overall enrichment capacity. The specific number of IR-6 centrifuges that Iran plans to install has not been publicly disclosed, but intelligence estimates suggest the expansion could involve 5,000 to 8,000 additional advanced centrifuges, which would increase total enrichment capacity by factors of 3 to 5 compared to current levels. The third component is the withdrawal from voluntary cooperation with IAEA inspection protocols that have provided international monitors with access to Iranian nuclear facilities beyond what is required under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This cooperation has allowed IAEA inspectors to verify that declared nuclear activities match Iran's public statements and to detect undeclared activities that might indicate covert weapons development. The withdrawal of this cooperation will eliminate international visibility into Iranian nuclear activities and will create uncertainty about what Iran is actually doing at facilities that inspectors can no longer access. If you want analysis this sharp, this willing to explain why coercive diplomacy fails when adversaries conclude they have more to lose from compliance than from defiance, this willing to show you that ultimatums create commitment traps where backing down becomes impossible regardless of consequences. Subscribe now to ensure you never miss an update as American strategy confronts the reality that pressure tactics accelerate the very outcomes they are designed to prevent. The strategic logic driving Iranian leadership to respond to Trump's ultimatum with nuclear expansion rather than capitulation reflects calculations about Iranian national interests, regime survival, and the credibility of American threats that differ fundamentally from the assumptions embedded in Trump's coercive approach. The Iranian leadership begins from the premise that the nuclear program represents a strategic asset that provides both security through deterrence potential and leverage in negotiations with Western powers. Surrendering this asset in response to an ultimatum would eliminate Iran's primary source of leverage and would leave the country completely vulnerable to American pressure on other issues, including regional influence, missile development, and support for proxy forces. The regime's survival calculation is that capitulation to American ultimatums would demonstrate weakness that would encourage additional demands and that would undermine the Islamic Republic's foundational narrative of resistance to Western hegemony. The regime has built its legitimacy over 45 years on the principle that Iran will not submit to foreign pressure, and that the revolution's purpose is to establish genuine sovereignty free from external dictation. Surrendering the nuclear program in response to American threats would contradict this foundational narrative and would create internal political challenges to the regime's authority and legitimacy. The credibility assessment of Trump's military threats is that actual American military action carries costs and risks that make it less likely than Trump's rhetoric suggests. Iran calculates that Trump understands that military strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities would trigger Iranian retaliation against American forces throughout the Middle East, against Gulf oil infrastructure, and potentially against Israeli targets, creating a regional war that would disrupt global energy markets and that would impose economic and political costs on the United States that Trump cannot afford. The Iranian assessment is that Trump's ultimatum is a bluff designed to force capitulation through psychological pressure rather than a genuine prelude to military action, and that calling the bluff by demonstrating resolve will force Trump to either back down or to execute military strikes that will prove more costly than he anticipated. The diplomatic calculation is that European allies, Russia, and China all oppose both Trump's ultimatum and any military action against Iranian nuclear facilities, and that this international opposition creates constraints on American freedom of action. Iran assesses that accelerating the nuclear program will create urgency for European powers to re-engage diplomatically and to offer sanctions relief and security guarantees that Trump's unilateral approach has made impossible. The theory is that by raising the stakes and demonstrating willingness to cross the nuclear threshold, Iran forces the international community to choose between accepting Iranian nuclear capability or supporting American military action that most nations view as illegal and destabilizing. The timeline calculation is that Iran can achieve weapons capability faster than the United States can organize international support for military action or comprehensive sanctions that would be more devastating than the maximum pressure campaign already in place. So, trainings. The announced expansion shortens breakout time to approximately 12 months, which is faster than the diplomatic and military preparation cycles that would be required for effective American response. By the time the United States has built international consensus and military coalition for action, Iran will have crossed the threshold into nuclear weapons capability, at which point military strikes become far more complicated because they might trigger nuclear retaliation rather than preventing nuclear acquisition. The technical pathway from current Iranian nuclear status to weapons capability involves enriching the existing stockpile of 60% enriched uranium to 90% weapons-grade purity, accumulating sufficient quantity of weapons-grade material for one or more weapons, and then conducting the weaponization activities necessary to fabricate that material into functional nuclear devices. The enrichment step from 60% to 90% is technically easier than the initial enrichment from natural uranium to 60% because the separation factors are more favorable at higher enrichment levels. Using the advanced IR-6 centrifuges, Iran could potentially enrich sufficient material for a single nuclear weapon in as little as 3 to 4 weeks once the decision is made to proceed to breakout. The weaponization activities are more uncertain because they involve design and fabrication work that is harder to detect and verify than enrichment activities that occur at known facilities. Iran would need to design a weapon geometry that achieves critical mass and sustained fission reaction, fabricate components including conventional explosives for implosion design and neutron initiators, and conduct testing to verify that the design works as intended. Western intelligence agencies believe Iran conducted weaponization research prior to 2003 and possibly continuing until 2009, providing foundational knowledge that would accelerate current weaponization efforts. The time required for weaponization is estimated at 6 to 12 months, which when combined with the enrichment timeline produces the overall 12-month assessment from current status to functional nuclear weapons capability. The military implications of Iran achieving nuclear weapon status fundamentally alter regional power dynamics in ways that cannot be reversed through conventional military options once the threshold is crossed. A nuclear-armed Iran would possess deterrence capability against American and Israeli military action that currently shapes Iranian calculations about regional activities. Iran could conduct more aggressive support for proxy forces, more open military activities in Syria and Iraq, and more direct confrontation with Gulf states and Israel, calculating that nuclear deterrence prevents escalation to direct American or Israeli strikes against Iranian territory. The proliferation implications extend beyond Iran to affect regional stability as other Middle Eastern powers reassess their own nuclear options. Saudi Arabia has explicitly stated that it will pursue nuclear weapons capability if Iran achieves nuclear status, potentially through rapid weaponization of civilian nuclear infrastructure or through acquisition of weapons from Pakistan, which has historical security cooperation with Riyadh. Turkey and Egypt would face domestic and strategic pressure to pursue nuclear capabilities to maintain their regional standing and security. The result would be nuclear proliferation cascade across the Middle East that would create multiple new nuclear weapon states in one of the most unstable and conflict-prone regions in the world. The Israeli response to Iranian nuclear achievement would involve impossible strategic choices between accepting Iranian nuclear capability and launching military strikes that might delay but cannot permanently prevent Iranian weapons development while triggering regional war. Israel has repeatedly stated that it will not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons and has conducted extensive military planning for strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. However, the operational challenges of destroying dispersed, hardened underground facilities are immense, and intelligence estimates suggest Israeli strikes could delay Iranian progress by 2 to 3 years at most, while causing Iranian retaliation that could include missile attacks against Israeli cities, Hezbollah rocket barrages from Lebanon, and regional war involving multiple fronts. The American military options for preventing or responding to Iranian nuclear breakout are all unattractive and carry consequences that make their execution questionable regardless of official rhetoric. Military strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities would need to hit multiple dispersed targets, including deeply buried enrichment facilities that require bunker-penetrating munitions and multiple strike sorties to achieve destruction. The air campaign would require days to weeks of sustained operations, providing Iran with extensive time to conduct retaliatory strikes against American forces at bases throughout the Middle East, against shipping in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz, and potentially against Gulf oil infrastructure that supplies significant portions of global energy demand. The economic consequences of regional war triggered by American strikes would include disruption of Persian Gulf oil exports that would spike global energy prices, potentially triggering recession in oil importing economies and creating political backlash against the administration that initiated the conflict. The military consequences would include American casualties from Iranian retaliatory strikes, potential loss of warships to anti-ship missiles, and extended regional conflict conflict that could require deployment of substantial American ground forces and commitment of military resources for years. The strategic consequences would include destruction of remaining diplomatic channels with Iran, solidification of Iranian-Russian-Chinese cooperation against American interests, and demonstration that American military power cannot prevent determined regional powers from achieving nuclear capability. The diplomatic fractures this crisis is creating between the United States and European allies reflect fundamental disagreements about the utility of coercive diplomacy and the wisdom of ultimatums that eliminate negotiated pathways. European governments, including France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, invested significant political capital in negotiating and implementing the JCPOA, which successfully constrained Iranian nuclear activities between 2015 and 2018. These governments view Trump's decision to withdraw from the JCPOA and reimpose sanctions as the original strategic error that created the current crisis, and they view his current ultimatum as compounding that error by eliminating any possibility of diplomatic resolution. The European position is that Iran's nuclear expansion is a predictable and indeed inevitable response to American withdrawal from agreements and imposition of sanctions without offering diplomatic alternatives. European officials argue that Iran demonstrated willingness to accept significant constraints on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief and normalized economic relations, and that American refusal to honor those agreements while demanding additional concessions has destroyed Iranian confidence that diplomacy can produce acceptable outcomes. The European assessment is that Trump's ultimatum will not force Iranian capitulation, but will instead accelerate Iranian decisions to cross nuclear thresholds, and that the resulting crisis will create pressure for military action that Europeans oppose and will not support. Subscribe to this channel because in a world where ultimatums trigger the exact crises they claim to prevent, where pressure tactics accelerate adversary decisions to acquire the capabilities that pressure was designed to forestall, where the gap between coercive rhetoric and operational reality produces strategic failures that reshape regional power balances. Analysis that explains why these failures occur and what their consequences will be is essential for understanding that strength is not measured by willingness to issue threats, but by ability to achieve objectives through means that adversaries cannot counter or circumvent. The Chinese and Russian responses to this crisis reflect their broader strategic competition with the United States and their interest in demonstrating that American coercive diplomacy fails when applied to nations with sufficient resolve and alternative partnerships. Both China and Russia have maintained economic and security cooperation with Iran despite American sanctions, providing Iran with markets for oil exports, sources for technology and weapons, and political support in international forums. The Iranian nuclear expansion provides China and Russia with opportunities to position themselves as responsible diplomatic actors seeking negotiated solutions while portraying the United States as reckless aggressor risking regional war. The Russian position is that the nuclear crisis is entirely the result of American withdrawal from the JCPOA and that the solution is American return to compliance with the agreement and lifting of sanctions that have prevented Iran from receiving the economic benefits that were promised in exchange for nuclear constraints. Russia has offered to host negotiations between Iran and Western powers, but has made clear it will not support additional sanctions or military action against Iranian nuclear facilities. The Russian calculation is that the crisis creates opportunities to expand Russian influence in the Middle East, while demonstrating to other nations that resistance to American pressure is viable when alternative partnerships exist. The Chinese position is similarly focused on criticizing American unilateralism while offering diplomatic support to Iran without accepting Iranian nuclear weapons development. China has significant interest in Middle Eastern stability due to energy import dependencies, but also has interests in challenging American ability to dictate terms to sovereign nations and in demonstrating that the international order is multipolar rather than American-dominated. China has increased economic cooperation with Iran despite American sanctions, providing crucial markets for Iranian oil and sources for technology and consumer goods that sanctions are designed to deny. The Israeli political response to Iranian nuclear expansion involves intense pressure on the United States to take military action before Iran crosses the weapons threshold, combined with public statements that Israel retains the option to act unilaterally if American action is not forthcoming. Israeli Prime Minister has stated that Israel will not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons regardless of international opinion or diplomatic constraints, and Israeli military forces have conducted exercises and preparations for large-scale airstrikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. However, Israeli military and intelligence officials privately acknowledge that independent Israeli action has limited probability of destroying Iranian nuclear capability and high probability of triggering regional war that Israel cannot sustain without American military support. The domestic American political dimensions of this crisis create additional constraints on Trump's freedom of action and create accountability questions about whether the ultimatum strategy was properly vetted through national security processes. Congressional leaders from both parties are demanding briefings about the intelligence assessment supporting the ultimatum and about the military planning for potential strikes against Iranian facilities. Progressive Democrats oppose military action and are introducing legislation that would require congressional authorization before any strikes occur. Traditional Republican foreign policy voices are divided between those who support maximum pressure on Iran and those who view the ultimatum as strategically counterproductive escalation that has made the situation worse. The question that Trump's national security team is now confronting is whether to modify the ultimatum to provide diplomatic off-ramps that might slow Iranian nuclear expansion, or to maintain the ultimatum and prepare for military action that carries enormous risks and uncertain outcomes. The policy options are all bad. Backing away from the ultimatum without achieving its objectives would demonstrate that American threats are not credible and would encourage adversaries to test future American red lines. Maintaining the ultimatum while Iran proceeds with nuclear expansion creates the worst outcome, where threats prove ineffective and American credibility is damaged without achieving policy objectives. Executing military strikes carries all the consequences previously described and has low probability of permanently preventing Iranian nuclear achievement. The arms control community assessment is that the Iranian nuclear expansion represents the final collapse of the non-proliferation regime's ability to prevent regional powers from acquiring nuclear weapons, when they conclude that such weapons are necessary for regime survival and national security. Iran would become the first nation to withdraw from or violate the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and successfully achieve nuclear weapons capability despite international opposition, creating a precedent that other nations will study and potentially follow. The normalization of nuclear proliferation in regions beyond the established nuclear weapon states represents a fundamental shift in international security architecture with consequences that will extend for generations. Has Trump's ultimatum permanently destroyed the possibility of diplomatic resolution of the Iranian nuclear crisis and guaranteed that Iran will cross the nuclear threshold regardless of international pressure or military threats? Or can diplomatic initiatives by European powers and international organizations create pathways that slow Iranian expansion and preserve possibilities for negotiated solutions? Can military strikes meaningfully delay Iranian nuclear achievement without triggering regional war that creates worse outcomes than acceptance of Iranian nuclear status? Or has the moment for prevention already passed, with the only remaining questions being how Iran achieves nuclear capability and how regional and global powers respond to the new reality of a nuclear-armed Islamic Republic? Your engagement keeps this analysis independent and sharp. This is what strategic failure looks like when ultimatums meet resolve. This is what happens when coercive diplomacy creates exactly the crisis it claims to prevent. Stay sharp, stay ahead, and never stop questioning whether strength is measured by willingness to threaten or by wisdom to achieve objectives without creating catastrophes that threats cannot reverse.